Hello and welcome to Proper-Gander, where today we're joined by Heiko Khoo, revolutionary Marxist, world renowned. Fuck me, that was hard. Hello, Heiko.
How you doing? All right.
All right, thank you for joining me. How you doing?
Good.
Yeah, brilliant. So I've got you in here today because you are champion communist, Marxist, and I thought if there was someone to talk to about communism, Marxism, you'd be the man.
I'll try.
You try. So basically, the main reason is we know each other through protest and through Speaker's Corner. Basically, we've been standing in the face of tyranny, in opposition to tyranny. And there's a lot of people from the sort of freedom movement struggle with. They think you're a blinder when you're out there doing your activism and the rest of it, but they really struggle to get their head around the whole communism thing. So I thought we'd try and help people to sort of get your position and why you think it's a good thing, and then we can have a talk about it, if you don't mind.
Sounds good, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So first on the agenda, do you see any parallels with what's happening today in so much as the culture war, with things like the refugee situation, things like the RSE, meaning religious and sex education in schools, of bringing things to children's attention like that are not particularly age appropriate, could be perceived as like they're not age appropriate, all this sort of stuff. Do you think there are parallels with the Cultural Revolution, the Maoist Cultural Revolution?
Not really. Mao's Cultural Revolution was quite, like, in terms of those type of concepts of culture war that we're talking about today, the general approach at that time was quite conservative. Having said that, they declared that they were against. So there's some elements you sprang that on me like that, so I have to think about it. There's some elements you might say that are a bit like that. They said they're against the old, and so they attacked things that were supposed to be the old. So, for example, in literature, they banned, I think there were only 12 literary books published in the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. There were scientific and technical books, but 12 literary books, and they tried to eviscerate alternative literature. There were people who would be arrested for reading Shakespeare, or people who had, because basically their concept was people who had a connection to the old feudal or feudal bourgeois regime. In fact, it wasn't really feudal ever, but anyway, the old regime from before 1949 were somehow hindering development in China, which a lot of the young people came to believe would be best served by a united collectivist mass, so like a sort of army, bringing about the changes that need to be brought about. And some of them thought that
An army of what? Army of who?
I mean, like an army. I'm drawing like a parallel with an army. So if you want to achieve an objective, if Britain wants to defeat an enemy that seriously attacks it, then it forms an army to do so.
But the parallel I'm drawing is the long walk through the institutions. The parallel I'm drawing is the use of the academics and the people in study to force this culture change.
Right. Well, that's different.
That's a different thing.
The Cultural Revolution was a movement where it began actually when one student in China refused to write anything in their exam, and Mao Zedong found out about this and he said, "I support that." And then the other thing was someone made a criticism of somebody else using an ancient Chinese analogy, like a story from the past, from the ancient history, which criticized bureaucrats. And basically in China there were conflicts between the tendency to drive towards private accumulation and private profit, as a means of spurring people on to do things, incentive to do things. Like
Right.
you run a little business, incentive to do something. Yeah? And on the other side, centralized control to achieve something, mobilize an army, build a road. Yeah? So these were the pressures that dominated Chinese society from the 1949 revolution until today. Still the central pressures today. And but these also reflect social pressures. They reflect different groups of people within society with different interests. So poor peasants, poor working class people often thought that the people who were accumulating power were doing so and abusing power, were doing so in a way that was sometimes perhaps connected to the old order. It was people who had been officials in the past, people who had been wealthy from wealthy families who had some cultural heritage, whatever. So so there was a tendency then to go overboard with that and smash their, if you like, their icons, their books, their culture, and try to create a completely blank slate from anew. So that wasn't like going through institutions, that was smashing it.
Right.
Smashing it out the window.
Right.
And they would take people who are intellectuals, but an intellectual could be anybody. I knew a guy I was teaching in China, he was a brain surgeon. He was 22 years of age, one of the leading brain surgeons in the country. This was 1991. And he was studying English to go to England to advance his knowledge. And he had been from a poor background, from an intellectual background. And his family were then considered to be black sheep. And he was often beaten up on the street, even as a little kid, and called a black sheep. Because a black sheep was someone who had intellectual background, who had
Right.
knowledge, who had this cultural background from having been from the old elites.
Right.
So they were attacked in the Cultural Revolution for being counter-revolutionaries. And therefore, and it would be decided by your background, your family background decided who you were.
Was there names? Was there not names to call these sorts of people? Like, were there not red names and black names?
Yeah, there were categories. There was something like 12 categories of people who would be counter-revolutionaries.
Right.
Yeah.
And then is that not a parallel to what we have today with the people being shouted down, being called a fascist, being called a Nazi, or being called an ally or comrade, for instance? Like, is that the same? No, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's a valid point. It's different. You could draw some parallels, but I think it is different. There was a separate but associated Maoist movement in the Western world that sprang up around the student movements in the 1960s. So there was Rudi Dutschke in Berlin. There was Daniel Cohn-Bendit in Paris when the student movements began in 1968. And I've got a soft spot for one of them, and that's Rudi Dutschke. Rudi Dutschke was in West Berlin. He came from East Berlin. He came from a Christian family, and he believed in some kind of Christian Marxism. He believed in, and he didn't escape, but they left in the early 1960s. And then in West Berlin, he went to university there. And when the Vietnam War was going on, you got to remember West Berlin was in the middle of East Germany, and so when these conflicts broke out, he believed that they could mobilize the people in West Berlin by creating a sort of regular protest force. And because it was an enclosed city, they could disrupt the city of Berlin, disrupt the institutions in Berlin, and in that way undermine the entire Cold War order. And, if you like, make revolution that would spread from West Berlin to Germany, to East Germany, and everywhere. So it would be a knot that would untie all these different contradictions in the world. So he was opposed to the Eastern regime and opposed to the Western regime. And they shot him. They had someone, Bruno Unzerberg, someone was shot, and then Dutschke was shot as well. And he later died from his injuries. And he had his interesting character. He although he was mortally injured from his injuries from the shooting, he wrote to the person who shot him and established a friendly relationship with the guy who had shot him. So he was quite a character, And he went on one famous TV show, like a half-hour interview they did with him, and he made a really good representation from his views. And they were you said they were students, so mainly middle-class students, and it was also a factor in Berlin that you had the only part of Germany where you didn't have to do military service was Berlin,
Right.
West Berlin. So if you were in West Germany and you wanted to avoid military service, you joined, you went to university or you moved to Berlin and you lived for 10 years in Berlin until you were no longer of military age. And so it attracted all this countercultural movement, you know, all the
Right.
pot smokers, all the hippies and all that sort of thing. So it became like a focal point for all the hippies of not only of Germany but all of Europe would sort of gather there and set up communes and God knows what, you know what I mean? Occupied houses, communes, you know, all that sort of thing. So out of that sprang some of the countercultural ideas which later became associated, or at that time became associated with Frankfurt School and all that type of thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
So there is a direct.
There is a connection.
There is a connection.
Yeah.
No.
With that layer of Maoists in Western Germany
Right.
and across Europe.
Right.
And the reason why that was because, and that's interesting, because it was, the Soviet Union was known to be quite stagnant and stifling atmosphere, if you like, and it had become very bureaucratic. And Mao Zedong disagreed with the internal bureaucratization in China. At least he verbally disagreed with it because it was undermining his power base, and he had a slightly different power base. And so he called for this cultural revolution to mobilize the youth in China to fight against these bureaucrats who were, if you like, were threatening his position, and some of the capitalists, which included at that time Deng Xiaoping and people like that. And they got sent to the countryside. So, for example, Xi Jinping, the current leader of China, his family was sent to the countryside, and he lived in a cave when he was in the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
So he was pushed down. So in China, you can go down and come back up again. You see what I mean? Deng Xiaoping, the same thing. He was removed from power, driven down, accused of being a counter-revolutionary, capitalist road, and all the rest of it, and then later re-elevated.
That's quite.
So
It's quite funny that they would call them sort of counter-communist, and then lo and behold, he gets to power, and look, is China a communist state?
No, it's not a communist.
Well, it's not a
I mean, it
communist.
calls itself communist.
Yeah.
So you can. There's two different ways of arguing. One is you can talk about the self-identity of people, right?
Yeah.
So and we got a lot of discussion about that nowadays. So because they call themselves communists, are they communists? Well, they're not communists because they call themselves communists, but because everyone calls them communist, it's pretty difficult to get around the idea, you know, and just say, oh no, in actual fact, blah 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 blah, which is what I would do, if you like, to try and scientifically analyse the regime. I would say, you know, you could take it apart and say it's actually not corresponding with what communism is supposed to be. But everyone calls it communist, so we can identify what characteristics we agree on that regime has got.
Before we do that, what I always do this ask about it. Why don't we go through what communist actually is, what communism actually is? Because then we can.
Okay, and even there's disputes. You see, communism originally. Well, I mean that's right. That's the nuance of it. You
Yeah,
know what I
right.
mean? Once you get to, it's one thing to discuss, like you say, in the anti-lockdown movement. For them, a lot of people, it's you got a one-party state, or effectively just one narrative, one story, the science, and all the rest of it, and one voice, one policy being made everywhere, police controlling people, and that equals that is very similar to or equates to the regime that had in the Soviet Union.
Stalinism.
So that's where that effectively.
Right.
Exactly. There's a nuance there. So you could call it Stalinism if you adopt a certain viewpoint about communism. You could say that Stalinism is a type of analysis of a type of regime that calls itself communist. But of course, communism has a longer history than that. Communism goes back to early Christianity and, you know, other early United States. And lots of communist communities established in America.
Early Christianity. What
Yeah.
do you mean?
Many of the apostles followers of Jesus tried to create collective communities where the wealth was shared, where people ate together. And in fact, there was a debate I had with Bob at Speaker's Corner, and he started talking in the end about some group that he thinks are real communists, you know, where they share the Brudolf, I think he called them, where they share the wealth and all this sort of thing. I didn't go into it because I didn't know anything about it, but there are many types of communities like that, particularly in America, had their origins after but a lot of the people who moved to America were communists of one type or another.
It is worth noting just for facts that the original followers of Christ were actually Jewish. So I think that's worth noting there. Whilst you're saying the original communists were followers of Christ. If that's got anything to do with it, who knows? But I just find it interesting.
I doubt that's got any real connection to it, but I don't know, and I can't affirm or refute what you just said. So I don't know.
All right.
I'll say.
So communism means a lot of different things to different people.
Yeah.
So that's what from so far what you're saying. Is
Yeah.
what
So one thing is the utopian communist experiment. So the type of idea that you could extract from Jesus's doctrines or the followers of Jesus, the idea of sharing the wealth, of living in a community, of not exploiting each other, that type of thing. There were people who believed in that. Having said that, having had that long discussion with Bob at Speaker's Corner one day, I did go and do a bit more reading and discovered that a number of the things that I said were wrong. One of which is that Christianity, the doctrines of Christ, were not per se opposed to slavery. Whereas I had thought they were, but they're not actually per se. They might have been perceived like that, but they weren't. The other people who were communistic also were the Spartans in the Spartan uprising, that type of thing. I Spartacus, that type of thing. So that's one strand, like the historical belief in equality, which has existed throughout much of history. It's been
equality.
Equality. That people share the wealth, that shouldn't be people rich and poor. In the English Revolution it was the same thing. Winstanley, the diggers, they went to Weybridge, just outside London, and set up like collective farms. They just dug the land. We would dig the land. When Adam spun and Eve sowed. Who was then the gentleman? Something like that. There's a phrase. I can't remember the exact phrase now. But anyway, that was like a poem they had at the time. A little ditty they had at the time, basically saying that in God's kingdom there was no, rich and poor.
All right.
Yeah. So that tradition has existed in many countries all around the world for millennia, and it harks back to an earlier concept of paradise, which I would argue is rooted in material realities, and that is that if you look at communities that are still very, very primitive. I was watching something on the internet the other day, some explorer goes down to a community that's never been encountered before, and then like there's one on literally this like some French or Belgian anthropologist guy. He went into the forest, must have been quite an old video actually, maybe 1970s or something like that, and looked at the way they lived and what their concepts were and how they related to encountering someone with new technologies. These were Stone Age people,
right?
And that, I think the concept of paradise, an egalitarian paradise, stems from this background, if you like, radiation, you might say, from the collective consciousness of mankind, that we did live like that.
That, to me, sounds very Gnostic.
I don't know enough about Gnosticism.
Well, in so much that you were saying background radiation of human consciousness, and so
what I'm saying
before we went live, I had a question for you, and you said, "Oh, that's philosophy."
Yeah,
right. And then you literally just said something that makes me think, well, that sounds like philosophy.
Well, it's more historical anthropology, isn't it? Because you're dealing with, like I said, communities that we know exist. Maybe one or two exist today, but we know all human beings came from this. The fascinating thing about a particular video, perhaps I'll post a link underneath it when I find it, because it is well worth watching. It's got multi-millions of views. But the interesting thing about that is that they say on there, is this where we all came from? So that's not philosophical. That's where we came from in one way or another.
Yeah, but all this ether, background radiation.
But I only use that phrase as to indicate that this is the background to our collective existence. We're animals after all,
Yeah, but again, also it's coming into existence as well. It's like it's sounding a bit religion-y. Is it not?
Well, I think a lot of religious ideas have their root in that. As I said, the concept of paradise, the concept of Adam and Eve, the concepts of some sort of
very
ideal spiritual background, probably have their origin, I'm speculating, probably have their origin in this, the sort of, the paradise, the pre-conflict of property.
Right. So property is the problem.
Properties, it's a problem and a solution. I mean,
That's a dialectic.
That's the dialectic. That's right. The problem. And when I do my walking tour, you've been on the tour. When I make the point, coming to the Stone Age man, that when man first shaped stones to allow them to shape nature, they separated themselves from the whole of the rest of the animal kingdom, and they made themselves into conscious beings. They developed language. They were able to shape the external environment. They were able to live in conditions which they physically could not do otherwise. They could clothe themselves. They could kill animals. They could break their marrow bones, increase the size of the brain, and therefore have to raise children outside the womb. A horse or a cat or whatever, they just run straight away, don't they? So we got and then a division of labour between men and women, much more sophisticated and developed. And from the hand axe comes everything else. All the tools and equipment we've got around us today come from that, ultimately. So he who or she who controls the tools controls the society and controls the ideas ruling in society. That's pretty Marxist type of thing. So that's where the idea then comes from, that, with the idea that Marx had, was that when you've got sufficient productive capacity, in other words, when human beings have developed technologies, their use and extraction of nature and the transformation of nature to such a level that there's no longer any need for a division between classes, then another type of communism can come about, a communism of abundance. So that's what Marx is talking about when he's talking about communism. That's what I refer to as communism.
Is that what Schwab's talking about when he says you'll own nothing to be happy?
Schwab's appropriated the terminology, yes. Yes. He's appropriated it. And there have often been times when there have been attempts to appropriate the language of the other side. Right. And the concepts of the other side.
I think this is a part of the big issue with the people from the movement. Like, there seems to be a lot of parallels with communism when you say things like you want to ban private property rights, things like this. You've got people like Klaus Schwab saying you'll own nothing and you'll be happy, and it all seems a bit close to home now. Like,
can't help it. I mean, the fact of the matter is, when a ruling class is threatened, or a ruling caste, could be in the Soviet Union. I remember in East Germany, when the East German Revolution began, we were fighting, and I wrote documents, articles, papers, journals, stating the rulers of East Germany are corrupt, are thieves, blah, 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 and we must remove them and establish democratic control, accountability, recallability. Officials should not receive a wage higher than a worker. People should learn to administer, and in that way we can create, if you like, we didn't say communism, but that was what common people would turn around and say, that's real communism. People would say to us that. Yeah. Ordinary people would say that. They'd say, Marx would turn over in his grave if he saw what was happening here. These people aren't real communists, etc. So what does the regime do? The regime adopts pretty much every single word that you say. Everything you say, they adopt. So what do? That's the reality. That's what actually happens in a revolution. The government adopts everything you say, says it's going to do that. And then they wait for the moment when you've calmed down. They pick a few people. Oh, you can come on board from that group. They met a round table in East Germany, round table. So everyone who's come forward at the beginning, they all get pulled into a round table, sit round with the government. How are we going to democratise? Yes, we all believe this. I don't know why it didn't work in the past. Something was holding it back. Maybe it was the Russians. Maybe it was some people in the army. Maybe
just make more bureaucrats.
Make a layer of people who are supposedly the representatives, and then they are tasked with they're given the piece of paper and say, try and realise this concept. And then they start becoming bureaucrats themselves.
Actualise
what the ideas are of this revolutionary movement, if you like. So in any revolution, there'll always be this tendency by the elites to, if you like, give you initially, when they fear for their power, they'll say anything. Yes, I did that. Yes, you can do that. Yes, yes, you can have that. Yes, you can have that. And So there are also people who do that sort of preemptively. So people like Klaus Schwab are preemptively making plans that will, if you're knowing that China's the way it is, knowing that the Soviet Union was the way it was, and make plans and things that appeal to a certain layer of the population who they want to incorporate within their type of power structure. So that's the bureaucrats, the officials, the scientists as they call them, the lower level managers, the teachers, the professors, the priesthood, the politicians, something that will keep them as agents in control of society, no matter what social unrest appears. So that's where people are correct. There has been some shift in the way in which they operate, and that is when you get a social movement begin, the layer of thinkers around this Klaus Schwab, if you like, sect or tendency or faction, try to make the system flexible enough. But I mean, that's the very nature of capitalist democracy itself, is it does that as well. Don't forget that. I mean, right from the time, well, the French Revolution or later, the 1848 revolutions, for example, they tried to incorporate, they tried to pull people in. They said, yes, you can come aboard, you can come in the government, you can become a minister, you can do what you like, do these proposals. And then once they'd got you wrapped up, then they watched out for the people they could attack, and then they launched an all-out assault against them and smashed them. So that's the way they operate. You got to know, and that's what I think serious Marxist analysis can provide. And I use that phrase carefully because I can understand that lots of people who say they've got serious Marxist analysis, so I just try and present what that is, what my view of that is. Is provide a bit of historical background to understand how these things happen again and again and again. They're not that new.
The science of history.
Well, yes. Is it a science? I don't know. It's
yeah.
It's an art of understanding it. It's an art of intervening in politics as well. You got to know. I mean, I remember when the Iraq War started. I remember I did quite a few radio shows at that time, interviewing people at Speakers Corner and stuff like that. And there was guys from the States came up, and it's quite funny. I remember distinctly staying in my head. He said, when I'm talking to people in America, they say America's never been to war before. And he's frustrated and freaked out because America's been to war like dozens and dozens and dozens of times, and each time something occurs, people think it's the first time it's ever happened. Because each generation learns anew, unless they have the historical consciousness, unless they have also, in theory, a movement that encapsulates and can provide understanding of the lessons of what happened in the past, so that they can try to avoid that. Mistakes of the past, if you like.
Is historical consciousness not something that comes with culture, though? Is that not? Are they distinct from each other?
Yes, it does, and that's why the idea of some kind of working class revolutionary movement is central to the idea of Marxism, and it rises or falls on that, stands or falls on that, really.
See, I don't see how that can be a thing with how the system is set up. Because I think there's too much opportunity. I don't think there's too much for Marxism. I believe that the opportunities are good enough for people to be able to advance their standard of living in the system that we've got. That there won't be a revolution of the proletariat.
Well, the assumption is that the countries that we're talking about, and don't forget we're in the first main capitalist country in the world. The assumption is that what's happening here is the centre of what's happening. And if you look, however, at Africa, South America, India, China, it puts a bit of context on it. If you were raised in Zhejiang, you'd have a different view. If you were raised in Mumbai, you'd have a different view.
Right.
If you were raised in Buenos Aires, you'd have a different view.
Yeah.
And in those countries, the attitude will be different to that. They don't see that type of opportunity available to them.
Right.
And so those places will in all likelihood be the centres of revolution.
And then it will spread out globally as the workers of the world unite.
It may do. I think that's a genuine possibility. Yes. And look, the anti-lockdown movement. Often people would turn up with their flag and think, a lot of the people in the anti-lockdown movement turn up with British flag, United Kingdom flags, and or even English flags or Welsh flags, and then there'd be a few people Italian flag. And I remember that I liked that. I remember recording a video, and Polish Catholics were there with like carrying some icon and with the Polish flag and all that. And that's great, but what does that actually represent? It represents the coming together of those national movements around a common cause.
Right.
So, and all of us cheered on when Canada broke out, and all of us cheered on when Australian building workers came out, and they cheered on when we protested. So internationalism is not just a dreamy communist idea. It's something that's very, very concrete.
When you're thinking about things from people from poorer backgrounds, but like I'm saying, in this country, just for example, like it's going to take a serious amount of degrowth and degradation for the masses to like, for instance, what's going on in France. Do you think that could come over here just by virtue of it being there? And I don't understand, like the circumstances are different in each place, right? Is what we're saying. Yep. So it's going to take a different level of circumstance for people to rise up. But that for something to happen on a global scale, that's working on the premise that this is all going to, everyone's circumstances are going to get equally shit at the same time, which is quite well believable now with everything that's going on.
What you're saying is there's a book by Leon Trotsky called The Permanent Revolution Results and Prospects, which is what you're basically quoting.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, unconsciously quoting. And basically what he says is there's uneven development. So uneven economic development, uneven political development, uneven class development, because of the way in which the economy is, focus will be on one country at one time, finance will go into one resource at one time, resources will go into one region at one time. There may be other factors that play a role in affecting why one country would rise and another country would fall. So, but at the same time, when European settlers went to the United States, they came there with guns. The North American indigenous had spears and bows and arrows.
Yeah, right.
But they didn't go through hundreds of years of development in order to take over the guns. They started using guns within 10 years.
Right.
So combined development means that the combination, that out of that unevenness comes the combination. So it's not true to say that you just get unevenness. Having said that, you'll get, let's say, something might be picked up. The chances of riots breaking out in communities in Britain are pretty high.
You think?
Are they increased by seeing what happened in France?
Right.
Yes.
Right, you do.
Are they likely to follow from France in Britain? Probably not. The countries that tend to follow France are Spain, Italy, Greece, and some of the Middle East and North African countries. The countries that tend to follow Britain tend to be the old colonial-related countries. But sometimes there are phases when those natural links aren't the central links that take place.
Right.
Another example of that would be, I wouldn't do that, but the Kennedy thing is an interesting thing because, again, out of the blue, you've got someone representing views which were taboo only 2 years ago, or even a year ago.
Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yeah.
Right.
And suddenly you've got someone in the mainstream. When people thought, my God, this whole discussion's been smashed, here you had someone as the core of the opposition to that, who's now in the mainstream, and they're saying he's got 49% support in America. If it was an actual democratic election now, or let's say in 6 months' time, in which any of these candidates could compete, rather than having to win the nomination, he'd probably win. Right.
Which goes to show some way of explaining the sentiment of the country.
Yes, but that must be worldwide as well. That type of flexibility of the mind that follows from the conditions we live under. Internet, communications, arguments, debates, rigidity of the mind. Revolution, there's an interesting quote there. The revolution doesn't come from the revolutionariness of the masses. It comes from the conservatism of the people. It comes because people are prepared to take shit again and again and again. And at a certain point, it boils over and breaks out. That's where revolution comes from. It doesn't come because people are revolutionary. That's the delusion that a lot of the left have got.
So it's the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yes.
It's just keep piling on, and at some stage it gets too shit, and people say, fuck this.
I mean, that's what causes the actual
Revolution,
breach,
right.
because people do try and get by as things are. They don't want to go to political meetings and rallies and revolutions. They don't want to do that.
No.
And you can see that now. The anti-lockdown people, they were all there, feeling how great it was, and then as soon as where are
A
they?
little lax. As soon as they
Disappeared.
relaxed the policy a little bit, that was it. Everyone's
Come back to the
new normal.
Yeah. But not quite the new normal, because a lot of them have still got that in the back of their brain, and now they also know that they've won the argument. I think most of them feel quite okay about the fact that they demonstrated. Anyone who went on demonstration against the lockdowns, they're not the
Smug
ones who think.
feeling,
Yes,
like-
they have a certain smugness.
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, and rightly so.
Rightly so. Right, so we've had a little talk about communism, a little bit. What does dialectical materialism mean?
Just before the show, we had a little chat about it. And I'm not a great expert on philosophy.
Right.
So I'm
okay.
not gonna
But
I'm not gonna
okay.
claim to
But
do that.
people want to
But
know about
what
Marxism.
Does it mean? What does
Right.
it mean? Marxism, as it's called, and that is a weakness on my own Marxism, if you like, because dialectical materialism is really what Marxism is. But
It is.
it's a-
Sorry, did
it's
you
a-
say it is?
It
It
is.
is.
It's a method of understanding change. Yeah. So philosophy lies behind most things. Most
Right.
people have some philosophy or other, and so the philosophy of Marxism was developed out of criticizing existing philosophies.
Hegel. Kant.
Hegel was one. Hegel was the official philosophy of Prussia,
Right.
and Prussia had become like quite a bureaucratized state, but one, as with the Germans in general, it's one where Germans have some bureaucratic skills. I remember when I first went to live in West Berlin, I lived with some young German people, and then one of them turned around and said, the Germans have got bureaucratism inside of themselves, and there is some truth to that. And I've had a number of encounters with Germans in politics and in working and stuff like that, to see that they rapidly adopt methods that, if you like, are the most efficient.
Right.
They'll have a tendency to do that. By what way do we do this most efficiently? So, for example, a little thing, but we were producing a magazine in Berlin, and then we all gathered round to like pack the magazines into envelopes. And in England, I think what would happen would be everyone packs the thing into the envelope their own way. Right, fold it that way, do that, just do your own bit. But there, you see, one starts packing it that way, the next one does it a little bit more effectively, and they're not like saying, "Oh, do it this way." They just start doing it, and suddenly everyone's doing it all the same way, and it's like piled up more quickly, And I do think that maybe it's an exaggeration, but it's things like that I've seen. I've worked in Germany. I've done politics in Germany, and they'll turn up for meetings when they're a member of a group. They'll turn up for a meeting, and they'll be there on time. It's not the norm in Spain, Italy, France, England, And so Hegel, towards his latter years, when he was the official philosopher of Prussia, was putting forward the idea that this bureaucracy could be tinkered with in order to realize God's idea on earth. Man was being driven, according to him, by a God-driven imperative to realize the idea of God on earth, his kingdom on earth, if you like, his way of
Utopia?
organizing things. Realizing his idea, realizing the will of God, if you like. And but in his early years, he'd seen the French Revolution, and he thought he was questioning everything. So he referred back to what was called the dialectic, which was the way in which people in ancient Greece, philosophers in ancient Greece, engaged in debate, was to put forward one conceptual idea, to go through all the different variants of what that idea mean, to put forward a counterposing idea, and go through all the variants of that, and allow these ideas to clash, and from that clash of ideas to produce a new synthesis, a development. And that would be a development from which you start again, and you continue to a new engagement and argument about the new concepts that you've laid as the foundation for the next phase. So that's the basic conceptual framework of dialectics. And then within that, the idea was that everything, Heraclitus had said, everything flows, everything changes. You can and you cannot step into the same river twice. So
That's a contradiction.
A river is a moving thing,
Right.
as everything is.
Right.
So the idea that everything's moving is a difficult concept to grasp, because all our orientation, our science, our mathematics is based upon the opposite. That things are fixed.
But what is the
Jim
river?
is Jim, Heiko is Heiko. The river is the Thames.
But is the river the water? Is the river the banks, or is the river all of it?
Well, exactly. That's another aspect to it. That's, I mean, just the water is one thing, but all of it is moving. So, and the entire universe is moving. So that's the point that Marx and Khoo are taking up, and they're saying everything's in motion, and what drives the motion? They said the internal contradiction within it. So if you know what the internal contradictions are, so in this case, gravity makes the water move, right? There could be some other factors. Could be a wind blowing and things like that. But gravity fundamentally is making the water move downhill. That's why it moves towards the sea, right? So, but it's got to be water again, you know. And there could be things blocking it, and it could be a dam and whatever else. But fundamentally, what are the contradictions driving something? What makes something move? So whatever the contradictions are that make something move, when you understand that, then you can help it to move.
Contradictions,
And
internal contradictions, the struggle between old and new.
struggle between opposites.
Opposites,
It
that's
could be
it.
old and new, but struggle
Yeah.
between opposites. So positive and negative
Right.
in mathematics. Temperature with water and ice. The examples always give water and ice. You know, you freeze some water and it turns into ice. It's no longer a river then, is it?
No.
So,
Right.
So, and that's at 0 degrees.
The
And
word
at 100 degrees turns to water vapor.
The word struggle as well. That's funny that's in there. I think like the struggle. Do you know, like because I feel like the struggle is what the proletariat goes through is the struggle, and then it's been used in this sort of context as well. I think the whole thing is very confusing. To be honest with you, I think it's convoluted, and I think it's like that. I don't know if it's on purpose.
But it's not confusing.
If you
At
know
that
it.
simplistic level, water turns into ice at
Yeah.
0 degrees. It's not
Right.
confusing. There's
Right.
a sudden state change in water, and we know that. Human beings come into existence and pass away. We know that.
Right.
There's no one, I mean, there used to be a guy at Speaker's Corner that said he's got eternal life, but otherwise there isn't any, right? So we know there isn't anyone who lives forever. So within the parameters of knowing that, we can then abstract using normal methods like the fingers to count
Right.
in order to understand things and make things, design things, but working on the base of knowing
We've got a time limit.
the parameters.
Right, can we get sorry, Heiko, can we get the air on, please? I'm absolutely sweating. I'm about to wet myself as well.
We better go to Lou then.
Yeah, do you mind? I'm just going to quickly pop toilet. Sorry, chaps. I'll be back, boys.
Do you want to at Speaker's Corner on Sunday?
Yeah, I was at Speaker's Corner this Sunday, but it was shit because there was a band playing, some K-pop band was playing, and it's difficult to speak when there's like this. You just get waves of sound come over. So 1 minute is all right, and next minute you get this whoosh, like this. I don't know how many watts they play. There's like 100,000 people listening to them. It's like pretty difficult to speak then, and your voice will just go. You know, one little strain too much, and the voice will just go. So.
They're not mic there anymore.
You know what?
They're not mics there anymore.
I mean, it's a good thing. You're not allowed to use a mic there, and it's a good thing because if you ever see people on the street with a megaphone or anything like that, like protesters or whatever, whoever's complaining about something, they get a megaphone, and as soon as they speak to people, no one's going to be drawn right into you if you're speaking through a megaphone. But if you're speaking with your voice, they've got every reason to come stand around you just to listen to you. And if you're really good at it, I mean, I've seen my voice was better in the past, but there was a guy called Lord Soper who used to speak at Speaker's Corner, and he had Shakespearean language, but he had this way of talking that he could pull in an audience of up to 300-400 people packed in just to listen. You know what I mean? It's like it's a type of performance. It's a special type of performance, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he was a Christian speaker, but he didn't talk much about Christ, but he knew how to pull them in, and he'd use that like. The relationship he had to them psychologically and through the tone of voice and all that, he'd use that to hold them and then to throw in the occasional bombshell, like, and Jesus believed that, what I mean, something like that, Music, he said, his sort of thing was, great music is the voice of God. So that's the type of way he'd do it. Great poetry is is the voice of Jesus. So, but he had the ability to hold them and to draw them in and to raise their understanding about things, and it was always that type of play.
Thank you very much. Right, sorry about that.
Right.
Right, the contradictions that drive things.
Yeah, well, so then comes the question of material forces. So dialectics is the contradiction, that things are driven by contradictions. So understanding what contradictions are within things or driving those particular things will allow you insight into how you will move something or how something will move. So materialism is quite simple. It's the material forces shape the inner world. The brain itself is a material force.
Right.
So,
but material means natural.
It means existing made of matter.
Matter. As opposed to thought.
Thought is
abstract.
Effectively is a type of motion in matter.
Right, so you're gonna have to slow down
in
a
my
little
opinion,
bit.
I could be wrong. So some Marxists might turn around and say, "What are you talking about? That man doesn't understand what he's talking about." But effectively, you're dealing with matter. Yeah, without the matter, there's no thought.
Right.
Yeah, without that matter in the brain being
Right.
attached to the spinal column and the body, there's also no thought.
So
So in other words, a machine cannot think.
No.
AI cannot think and will never be able to think.
Staunch. I like that.
Yeah, it has to be attached to the human body. But some people might dispute that. I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are plenty of AI experts who will turn around and say you're talking nonsense. But that's where we're at.
I don't know if do you need a soul to be able to think? Do you think?
I don't believe in the concept of the soul, but
You don't believe in the concept of the soul?
no.
What do you believe then? So you're not religious?
No.
Marxism's not religion?
I don't think so, no. I mean, you could accuse it of having characteristics like a religion. So, you'll have...
I accuse it.
Yeah. So you could say it's a belief, and as a belief...
That you have
could
faith.
say that at some stage there's some element of faith in there. You could say that.
But you've got to have faith
But
if you're
okay,
waiting.
you could have faith in a football team.
Yeah,
without being a
no, of
religion,
course.
But some people might say, "Oh, that's a religion," because
To what
my
extent
football team
you-
is a religion. So it's about these. That's where dialectical materialism comes in. So it's material forces are battling it out over control of the world, and human beings are those material forces, if you like, battling out about who owns and controls the resources to determine the fate of human history. So, but is there a soul? Is there a spirit? I don't think so, because that implies some religious, and I don't have that. I don't have that in me. I don't think so. Anyway, maybe some people can. Oh, very spiritual, because like I was talking about a minute ago when you were out the room. Lord Soper used to speak at Speaker's Corner to try and move them, And when you're doing speaking at Speaker's Corner, or you're trying to motivate people on a demo, you do that, and that's like inspired. It's not like you don't plan it.
Right.
You do it, and it just is done.
Happens.
That's part. I suppose you could say that's soul in that way. You know what I mean? Or a singer sings in a certain way, and
It resonates
with people. Yeah. So I suppose you could call that. I might call that some collective consciousness or something like
Well,
that.
this is when you said it earlier on. This is why I had to bring it up into the focal point, because I do believe
That's fair enough, yeah.
that it does seem very much like that, using that sort of language.
Yeah.
So we've gone over the dialectical materialism. I appreciate that.
Hey.
Thank you for going through that with us. I've asked you if China's communist. So Aufheben.
What?
Aufheben. Is that the same thing then? Is that the same as the dialectic?
It's effectively means overthrow, isn't it? Aufheben.
But I thought
Change.
I thought it's the contradiction though. I thought it means to do that and to do the opposite at the same time. That's what I read. So I wasn't. So I just think everything now. If I see a contradiction, I just think that's dialectic, mate. I don't know.
Overcome is effectively Aufheben.
Yeah, and to keep the same though.
Okay.
Is it not? I thought. But you probably know better than me. You're German.
Yeah,
like,
but just because that's often used in Marxist scholarship, and I don't read all that much scholarship.
Right.
about
Okay.
these
That's where I've
things.
gone wrong.
So that's no, it's fine. But people will throw, they'll write about Marx, and suddenly they'll say they use the German word instead of the English. And if you can't use the English, you probably don't know what you're talking about.
Talking about all these different sort of thoughts and beliefs around Marxism, because there's a lot of people that read into it different stuff. What do you think is the main reason for? Well, actually, let me ask a better question. Do you believe there's anywhere on earth that communism has worked?
Yes and no. It's dialectical.
Well, there's a
Yes,
shot.
because like in 1848, the revolutionary movements at the time, they were liberals, democrats, anarchists, socialists, nationalists, and they all tried to make revolution. They all tried to make Europe democratic. Some wanted socialistic.
Talking about the French Revolution.
No, the 1848 revolution.
beg your
So the
pardon.
revolutions in 1848
Right.
across the continent of Europe. It was
Right.
called the Spring of the People. And all across Europe, there were revolutionary movements, mainly urban affairs. People took to the streets, protested, demonstrated, and then it spread from one country to another, literally by word of mouth.
Right.
And but in each country where the political forces got engaged, there were different forces: the Democrats, the nationalists, the socialists, the anarchists. They all got together and joined in,
Right.
reflecting the two souls, which was the rising capitalist class. The Industrial Revolution created them, and the rising working class. They also were created by the Industrial Revolution, or better said, capitalism created the working class by bringing them into employment and bringing them into the factories to produce goods. So, I can't remember what I was talking about.
We was talking about somewhere where communism actually.
Oh,
worked.
right. The point being was that
Democracy come as a result of it.
democracy was a product of that.
But that's
So Marx ran a journal at that time called the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, the New Rhine newspaper, Organ of Democracy. By that he meant the democratic struggle across the whole of Europe, by the nationalists, by the socialists, and so on. And when they formed the First International in 1864, it incorporated these different forces. They wrote to Abraham Lincoln. Marx wrote to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wrote back to him, and he wrote to him congratulating him on his election as President of the United States and encouraging him to push further in the struggle against slavery, to liberate the blacks and get them on the side in the Civil War. And the nationalists, the Mazzini in Italy, Garibaldi in Italy, Kossuth in Hungary, they were aligned in one way or another with the International, with this, because they believed that the working classes would be the key force of the revolution. So it's only in the 20th century that we associate Marxism with one party rather than the working class leading a revolution. Although the
Right.
First International was effectively a party, but it was a party of all these different forces which would reach out as far as the Republicans in America to mobilize the workers to make revolution, to achieve their objective. And Marx was quite confident that each of these revolutions, when they experienced their struggle, would lean towards a workers' and socialist revolution.
But there's
That
not.
that would be the direction which it would take.
There's not a nation state though where.
Right. Okay. So then there's the question about what happened in the revolutions of the 20th century. So the struggle for democracy was part and parcel of the struggle of the working class in the 19th century,
Right,
beginning of the 20th
1880s,
century.
yeah.
The struggle against the First World War was also, in theory, that although the workers' parties capitulated,
Right.
that was the first real betrayal. Was the first.
They went
World
to
War.
war.
They sent the workers to war, and they declared in 1912 they had an international convention where they declared the workers' parties of Europe got together, and they were big parties by that time. They got together and they said, we will overthrow our governments if they try to send us to war. 1912, the Berne Conventional War, or International Conventional War. But they voted in favour of war credits, and they sent the workers to kill each other. So that destroyed the first Marxist international, or the second Marxist international, that they did that. And it was the war produced the revolution. It wasn't Lenin or Trotsky or Rosa Luxemburg.
First World War.
The First World War, which was a capitalist war. It was a war between big capitalist countries to control and redivide the world amongst them. Who plunders the world best? And in fact, the Second World War was the same thing, just as its peculiarity that Nazis were the driving force of the war, but or at least in Europe. But it was also a battle to who controls the world, who gets the resources, which capitalist country with its own indigenous capitalists will control and divide the world up. That's what it was really about. So, so out of that came, one, the end of the war was a product of the Russian Revolution. So that's one marker in its favour.
What for communism working?
The end of the First World War. They ended the war.
What
Having
happened
said
under
that,
Stalin, though?
well, okay, I'm not saying.
Yeah, the question was somewhere where it's worked.
Well, I mean,
And
saying
I don't mean the
Russian
slaughter of
Revolu-
hundreds of millions of
the
people in the
Russian Revolution
process.
ended the First World War.
Right.
So that's a victory. The struggle for democracy, Marxism was part of the struggle for democracy from the beginning.
Right.
The struggle against war, it should have been, but actually they capitulated.
Right.
So, I'm pointing out there were phases where they achieved, where they at least one, late 1912, officially declared they were opposed to the war, but then capitulated.
Yeah, but I
1917,
understand.
they made revolution, ended the First World War. In Russia, they tried to make revolution that would change the world. So they did end the war, and then they tried to spread the revolution to other countries, but it failed. And when it failed, the reaction was the rise of Stalin and the rise of Hitler.
Right.
So it was a consequence of the defeat of the revolution.
So there's been little victories for communism.
It's a war. I mean, it's a long. It's a
But
100-year war.
Yeah.
More than 100 years.
But there's not really, because you can't look at anywhere like Venezuela or anything like this, or one of these socialist states that has got plenty of resources, and be like, well, communism works. Because my argument is, I understand what you're saying, but there's always this human error issue. We always have humans that are inherently arseholes, basically greedy, whatever, not very nice, and it's an ego thing as well. I think a lot of it's to do with the ego. Like, there will never, I can't see it happening.
Right. Well, that's another question. I mean, that's whether something happens or not. Is
Yeah, but I think it's evident.
it's not as inevitable as the sun setting, or better said, the earth moving and the sun disappearing.
What about being a human being fallible and greedy and working in their own self-interest?
That's the issue. I mean,
Self-interest?
Yeah, but self-interest is, you can also have collective self-interest. I mean, you have a trade union because you have collective self-interest, right?
Yeah, then that gets taken over by mental wokeists, and then no one's got any self-interest. We're selling the party line again.
Well, I mean, the argument that
Education union, for example.
You're always going to have groups of people who form into interest groups. And so the starting point, before you get onto the second point you just made, so the starting point is you do have people forming trade unions, and you do have capitalists forming alliances. They will probably want to drive down the wages. The workers want to increase their wages. So these are real collective interests that do exist and that have manifestations today and 150 years ago. So we can say there are these collective interests, even at just a simple economic level. Yeah. Then you obviously have communities, that've got certain interests. Liverpool might have an interest that's slightly different to London, or things like that. So there are collective entities that are formed out of interest groups that are not just the individual. I want this. Family unit is also like that. Right? Families get together. They don't necessarily plunder each other. They might do sometimes, but they don't necessarily plunder each other. Sometimes they'll be altruistic in the way they behave. The raising of children is an altruistic activity. And there are lots of other altruistic organisations, nationally, internationally, in different, community groups, whatever. There are these things. So it's not just greed that dominates everything.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, but the people that lust for power. We're talking about them. we're talking about a sort of type. There's a chemical makeup of people, generally speaking, that want to do that sort of job or have that sort of power over others. And I would argue that the greed and the self-preservation and all that sort of stuff is highly probable with that sort of person.
I don't think there's a specific type, but I do know what you mean. I went to Venezuela when Hugo Chavez was in power. Chavez had a great ability to communicate with the people, but around him there was an entourage of crooks, and he had great difficulty trying to push them aside each time.
No, but this is the same thing.
Well, I'm trying to explain the dynamic of something I've literally seen. So, yes, that did happen. If you didn't want that to happen, what would you do? to try and prevent that.
But it
Or if you
doesn't
don't
work.
want-
That's the point.
Yeah, but then you might as well
because
just
of
say, well,
what you've just
then-
said. That's
but then
the
you-
reason
but
it
then you
doesn't
could turn around and
work.
say that nothing works, and it's not worth doing anything.
Ah, that's defeatist.
Well, exactly. So,
No, but communism doesn't work. That's the point.
well, but that's, I could just as well say that's defeatist. People have been struggling for.
Not when I'm giving a
century and a
rational
half.
argument as to why it doesn't work.
Sorry.
Not, you can't say it's defeatist when I'm giving you a rational argument as to why it doesn't work.
No, you're giving an argument based on the idea of greed.
Mm.
So what you were saying was effectively that greed aligns with the
People with
motivations and activities of those people who seize control,
That
and
lust for
that's an
control.
inevitability.
Mm. Well,
right?
not
Whereas I'm
inevitable.
saying that the greed, first of all, is divided between different sectional interests, that greed manifests itself in different organizational forms, and that people have an instinct to oppose that in exactly the same way that you do. For example, give an example from a meeting I attended with Chavez speaking. They were waiting for him to turn up. He was about an hour late, an hour and a half late, and all these like lower level bureaucrats got up and spoke, and the people already had them like marked and knew they were crooks.
Right.
And so when they were up, like everyone starts booing or starts like getting like annoyed, stamping their feet, whatever, and then they'd bring on someone else or bring some musician out or whatever it is. And eventually Chavez would turn up, and then Chavez would also castigate those people, but try, because he was quite isolated, he would try to mobilize the people from the grassroots to challenge those who were usurping power.
Right.
And to some degree it worked. For a period of time it did work. And then it didn't anymore. I don't think that's an inevitability, though. I think that's a living struggle. And I think that living struggle goes on all the time, all around the world.
Is greed not a contradiction?
Yes, precisely the type of things I was talking about a minute ago. Contradictory types of greed. So one is about resources. You've got greed about resources, and you've got different interest groups that form around those greeds. And then, but I mean,
in so much that it's the greed that's making the stuff happen. It's the greed is like the
motivating forces.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
Well, it can be, but there's also different types of greed there as well. The greed of the majority means they want to increase the ability to produce things more rapidly and effectively and of a higher quality, so that they can have more leisure and pleasure and whatever to improve their condition. Whereas in actual fact, under the system we live under, each improvement in technology, science and culture, or its advance, if you like, in theory, is used as a tyrannical instrument of power. And people do understand that. They do understand that the instruments, no one wants their mobile phone to be monitored by Google or Klaus Schwab or whoever else. No one wants, the majority of the population don't want, if there was digital currency introduced, they don't want it to be an instrument to control them by social credit. They don't want cameras to be surveillance agencies. They think they're there for some, benign purpose, to help the green or whatever it is. So whenever these things do appear, they aren't the product of mankind saying, yes, that's a great idea because that guy invented it and he's greedy and we want that greed to rule. They aren't saying that.
no.
So there are inherent in society is a clash with that, and a clash with the misuse of power. People instinctively dislike that. And what can I say about that? Well, at the fall of communism, or better said, the fall of East German regime, I witnessed that myself. I mean, I saw the people saying, we're opposed to this. And it was my belief at that time that they might be able to create something different to that, and that different thing would then be able to spread across Eastern Europe, Western Europe, as far as China. Now, it didn't work out that way, but it doesn't mean it was totally impossible that was the alternative scenario which would happen. And I've still got that point of view today in relation to China, for example, and the few other countries that are remaining.
Opinion or faith?
Opinion based on facts. There must be some reason why
It keeps going wrong. Sorry, I'm
Well,
sorry.
It's fair enough to say that, and I understand why you say that. It's perfectly logical to say that. It might seem like I'm completely bananas because I'm saying something different to that.
Well, for a very
But on
well-read
the other
man,
side-
it's like...
But on the other side, you could ask yourself, why is the Communist Party of China in power? Is it in power just because it rules by ruthless dictatorship?
Do people go missing when they talk bad of the party?
Do people go missing here?
No, I asked you first.
Some people, not many people. Not many people in China go missing when they talk bad about the party. No,
Right.
not many. Some people probably do, but not many.
Has Jack turned up yet?
Huh?
Has Jack turned up yet? What's his name? He went missing a little while ago, didn't he? The founder of what's it called, Alibaba, whatever it is.
Oh, he's turned up, yeah.
Mm.
He's running a philanthropic adventure.
Oh right.
Yeah.
Nothing untoward there going on then.
Well, but he's a multi-billionaire.
Right. So he can
He's a multi-billionaire who's got resources.
Yeah.
And and if he's got those resources, he is considered a threat to the rulers of China.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying the rulers of China are communists, but I'm saying there is a reason why the regime calls itself communist, and it's different to what we have here. You see, if the theory that communism is everywhere in the world and all the regime, Klaus Schwab and co, are all establishing a universal communist tyranny, well, why don't they just call it communist like China does? Why don't they just why don't they say we're going to put one person in charge, Klaus Schwab, alongside Xi Jinping, or just Xi Jinping, or just Klaus Schwab, and the whole world will be run on a single tyrannical regime.
To get there, you've got to,
in the name of communism.
You've got to sell it to the West, who've been fighting communism in their head for the last. What do you mean why?
Why the difference?
Because you've got to Klaus has got to sell this whole idea, what he's doing through the Green Party, through the whole green angle, the enslavement of humanity. You've got to sell that to them, because that's what it is ultimately.
Do you think the Chinese people think they're enslaved?
But the ones that can't leave the country or get on public transport, come on, Heiko, mate.
That's
the ones that are getting publicly shamed because they've got a low social credit score, come on, Heiko, mate.
Well, I mean, I recently looked at how that's applied, for example.
Right. Or the Uyghurs, for instance.
Let me just do one thing at a time. One thing at a time.
Right.
So first, in relation to the social credit score, how that's practically applied.
Right.
Who it's practically applied to. So one of the things, I think I gave you a document, you read some of the stuff about that. So there's a process called Yinao in China. And Yinao is like medical unrest.
Mm.
So in China, I mean, Debbie Hicks here got in trouble when she was arrested and taken out of a house for going and filming a hospital.
Right, I remember, yeah.
Right, in China, you can go and film a hospital. Right. In fact, in China, up until about 2017, I think it is, it was standard in all the main cities for people to protest at hospitals.
Right.
Because migrant workers didn't have the same rights as urban workers, and about half the workforce in China are migrant workers. So you've got millions and millions of workers, hundreds of millions of workers, like twice the population of Europe,
Right.
who are new working class or working class. Half of them are new working class.
New working classes.
Means about your age, moved from the countryside to the cities.
From a peasant to a working
From
class.
the countryside to the cities, and are working in the cities in industry or in services, and they have had a massively improving living standards for 20 years,
Right.
or 30 years. And so they're quite confident. They don't take shit. They don't just, some bureaucrat tells them to do something, just tell them, fuck off. And I've seen it myself on the streets in China. You go down the street in China, some guy with a red armband shouts at someone on a bicycle, you do this, stay at the traffic light, whatever. They'll start an argument with them. A crowd of 500 workers will gather around them and shout at them, shout at the copper. If a
Right.
copper comes along, they'll shout at them. So the coppers are very, very hold back in China because they fear that they'll be lynched
Civil
or beaten up
unrest,
by crowds, which can just form at an instant. There's millions and millions and millions of people in the cities. They're not bothered about pictures of them on the street or something like that. They don't give a shit.
Right.
Just the same as some of the anti-lockdown people, but much more militant. This is huge, millions and millions and millions of people like that.
You asked
so the
me.
point being, in the hospitals, the people protested, and then the government recently changed the law, and the law was, because the problem was these protests were so commonplace that the hospitals could no longer function, the doctors were scared to go to work, and so on and so forth. So people would go into hospital, they might take a sword, chop up a few doctors, and get them to, give compensation or whatever. So massive protest and unrest was taken around the place around the hospitals. So the government tried to contain this by changing the law by creating some regulatory framework whereby people could lodge complaints
Right.
about mistreatment in hospitals, and also imposing sanctions on those people who've been responsible for that type of unrest. For example, not arresting them for 2 days because that doesn't do anything to deter them, but instead posing long-term social credit sanctions on them.
But the question was,
That's where it's applied.
do I think
It's not a
that-
general thing in China.
Do I think Chinese people feel like they're imprisoned in China?
No.
But then you didn't rebut the first one.
What, social credit?
No flying and no trains.
Well, that's who it's applied to. Those people. That's what I'm saying. Those are the people it's applied to.
Well, there's bad social credit
People
scores.
yes. I mean, that's a concrete instance I can give you now.
Right.
Most people, I'll put
I
a
would
link.
suggest they feel like they're imprisoned.
I'll put a link under this video. There was a guy who went round in China interviewing people in the big cities.
Right.
Have you ever heard of the social credit system? Most people never even heard of it. Well, it's just true. And there's a study done by Merck, one of the leading research bodies on China. I can put a link again under the video.
Thank you.
Which is a recent study on development of social credit. Most social credit applications and restrictions are imposed on companies, and it basically is a mechanism for controlling tax evasion and stuff like that.
You
Only a
understand? You're
tiny
sitting
minority.
there telling everyone, "Don't worry, Klaus Schwab.
I'm not saying don't
Klaus
worry, I'm
Schwab
saying-
stuff's not going to affect
No,
you."
I'm saying what's happening in China is not the same as what's happening here. So because some mechanisms of control exist in China, which are not as ubiquitous as people are making out, that's what I'm saying to you. They're much more nuanced than you imagine.
Right.
And they're applied to specific layers. It doesn't mean they don't
Dissidents
want to do
normally.
that. Not really dissidents, more corporate corruption.
Really?
Yeah. And I'll give you an example about the dissidents because, for example, we were protesting in Britain for
Hong Kong.
2 years against the coronavirus restrictions.
Right. Well,
Large-scale protests on the streets. Many thousands, many tens of thousands. The protests in China broke out in, I think, 25th of November 2022, and they lasted for 5 days. And after those 5 days, all restrictions were removed, including the Green Code,
get in.
all those things. They were all removed. And there was no vaccine mandate in China. And why wasn't there a vaccine mandate? Because they said, the Financial Times, I can quote you, they said, if they tried to impose a vaccine mandate in China, the old people, it would be a step too far for Xi Jinping. The old people would rebel, and they would meet dramatic social resistance.
What about the videos of people jumping out of buildings when they was locked in them and stuff like that?
Yeah, in Shanghai.
Is that real?
Probably.
And that was a result of the policy, the COVID policy, of locking them down in their rooms and not letting them out and the rest of it.
People commit suicide in Britain as well. People live in high-rise blocks in China, so it's a way of committing suicide, isn't it? Lots of people commit suicide in England, by other means. I don't know what the percentage relationship is. I'm not saying support that.
No.
I'm describing the dynamics of the protests on the streets in China that opposed the lockdowns. And when the lockdowns ended in China, the other aspect to it was exactly that people live in tower blocks and the lockdowns. And I'll come back to I wanted to talk about. I mentioned at the beginning. Or before we started, I wanted to talk about that.
Right.
What I found out about the
Yes.
lockdowns in China, because that is very interesting to understand this dynamic. It wasn't Xi Jinping imposing these lockdowns. That's where the misunderstanding
Spy
comes in.
being sage.
It wasn't that either.
What was it?
It wasn't that either. It was the local level petty bureaucrats.
Right.
In the housing block, residents committee, like you got a block of 1,000 people live in a housing block. The residents' committees put up the barriers. And the residents' committee would have maybe 5, 10 people and some volunteers who were COVID believers
Right.
who would put on hazmat suits and stand at the gate.
Enthusiasts. Yeah, right.
Enthusiasts. They would put on hazmat suits and stand at the gate. And those people were the people imposing the lockdown, not Xi Jinping or somebody like that. So now the evidence for that is quite extraordinary because I didn't look. I don't know why I didn't look at it, but I didn't look at it until the last 2 weeks. And I went back to the beginning of the whole thing, and what happened was, in the 12 days before the lockdown in Hubei, 1 billion journeys were made, and everyone went home. It's a bit like Christmas here, but it's more important in China because so many people are migrant workers.
Right.
So nearly half of the workforce are migrant workers. So they move maybe 1,000 miles, 2,000 miles to go to work, and they stay in that town. And only once a year they go home.
Right.
So there's a period of 40 days called Chunyun when people travel home, and then they have staggered return to works in those periods. So you might spend 2 weeks at home and come back after 2 weeks. And it began in 2020 on the 10th of January, and the lockdown came on the 23rd, right? And that was in Hubei and Wuhan is the city, Hubei the province.
Right.
65 million people, like population of Britain, right? So in the days running up to the lockdown, Xi Jinping knew there was a virus or some illness or some panic going around. Yeah? It doesn't matter which is true. They knew something was going on,
Right.
and the world was talking about it,
Yeah.
right? And he was advised by the leading epidemiologist in China, whose name is Zhong Nanshan. He was in charge of the SARS campaign in 2002, 2003. 2003 to 4, sorry. And he was put in charge. So the reason for that is that the Chinese government wants to make a separation. What if something goes wrong, Jim gets the blame instead of me.
Yeah,
So
right.
obviously you want someone else to take the blame,
Patsy.
just in case. And you can pat him on the back if he's good, or you can chuck him down the river if he's not. So what happened? They allowed everybody to move, and this is the biggest annual migration of human beings on Earth. And it happens every year, but this time it was bigger than ever before. 1 billion journeys, 38 million plane flights. Hundreds of millions, I think it's 300, 400 million, I'll cite the figures later on, 400 million people travelled on train. They didn't have masks, and then they weren't even advised to have masks at that time. Xi Jinping appeared in Yunnan province on the 19th of January, so 4 days before the lockdown. There's a video of him marching in Yunnan, surrounded by kids all singing at the top of their voice. Hundreds of kids singing songs. So no worry about super spreader event there.
Oh, right.
Then, the biggest television event of the year is a giant gala with many thousands. You know how the Chinese Olympic Games, they have this huge celebration with thousands of people. Chinese New Year, they have a gala.
Right.
It's the Chinese New Year Gala 2023. You can look it up on the internet yourself. And you'll see it on the 24th of January, one day after the lockdown in Hubei, they still had this gala. 590 million people watched that on television. So they got together with their families in groups and watched the television.
Right.
So super spreader event.
Yeah.
1, super spreader movement. 2, super spreader main event. Chinese New Year, everyone gets together, everyone catches it.
Right.
Then the government sat down with Xi Jinping, sat down with Zhong Nanshan, the leader of the epidemic control, looked at the data. Is there any evidence of large numbers of people coming down desperately sick after this mass super spreader event that we permitted? No. What actually happened was the numbers began to fall. Almost immediate lockdown was imposed. And that was only imposed on one province. So because the numbers began to fall then, it could not have been caused, the fall in numbers could not have been caused by the lockdowns.
No.
The fall in number followed immediately after the lockdown. So in other words, during the period in which people were moving and catching if they're catching something from each other, it would have been in those 12 days before the lockdown. And on the day of Chinese New Year, 24th, when the gala was happening. That's when people would have caught something. So then there would have been incubation period, then there would be sickness period, then there would be hospitalization period. That's when
Right.
they'd know something.
Yeah.
But it fell at the very first phase.
Right.
On the 25th, 26th, 27th, it began falling. So they knew nothing was going on. And Xi Jinping on the 3rd of February called for people to return to work. The lockdown was 23rd of February, 23rd of January, 3rd of February, he called for reopening. But he was ignored.
Right. I was going to say,
Right.
I thought they kept lockdown for longer than
They
that.
ignored it. The local officials suddenly had power
How?
because they were blocking the roads. They were putting the thing up, and they suddenly said, we're in control, not the fucking people, not the top bureaucrats, not the crooks, not the whatever. We're now in command, right? So they suddenly had control of who goes in, who goes out, who does this, who does that. Those people didn't want to give up their power. And they felt they were exercising a general rise in their power. And that has some parallel with the Cultural
The
Revolution.
ego and the power.
It's a
and
different
the
group of
greed,
people.
and it's all the
Not
same
really the
stuff.
greed. They did it in the name of, like everywhere else.
It's
in
the ego.
name
The
of,
ego. That's the ego. And the greed is for power. When I say greed, I mean lust for power.
Yes, but there's different. But we're dealing with different. This is a specific type of
Right.
situation.
Yes.
With a specific type of constellation
Yes.
of people seeking to do certain things.
100%.
And it wasn't the leadership of China doing that.
No.
The leadership of China was being opposed by these
Baby
people on the
bureaucrats.
grassroots. Yes, but baby bureaucrats connected with the voluntary organisations who were basically the grassroots, who were basically people who had thought they're not looking after us, the healthcare's run down, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
So, the type of Corbynite type people in Britain,
Revolutionary.
they weren't revolutionary, but they thought they were doing some good.
Well,
Yeah, and then they thought we're not being treated properly by the rulers.
right.
And so we're going to assert our authority until we know. And then the bureaucrats above them were scared because they were pressured from below. Well, and the truth of the matter is there is no proper healthcare system in China. So if someone comes down with a cough, you don't know what they've got, right? There was no test, right? They didn't have any PCR test in those days to verify or reject. And only the main hospitals had CT scans, so they couldn't tell whether someone had pneumonia or not. Either they were dying or not, and they weren't dying.
Just for everyone watching, you can't diagnose with a PCR test anyway.
Well, that's fine, but they didn't think you could diagnose with a PCR test. In any case, they didn't add the PCR test. But,
Right.
whatever the international categorization was, PCR tests, it didn't exist, except in the major hospitals. The initial testing rate, I checked that, so just before lockdowns, or time of lockdown, they could test 200 a day, yeah? And out of a population of 1.4 billion, yeah? So, and then they started ramping up. Now, the interesting thing was, I looked through the CTC records for the whole of the period from 2020 until 2020 into 22. And what was revealed was, in April, the first time they revealed the actual proper data, 80% were asymptomatic. And then that continued pretty much 50% for most of the rest of the year. 2021, 50+%. 2022, 80% asymptomatic. And Tom Jefferson from the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, at the very beginning, he said, what it means is that they've already had this. So it wasn't anything new.
Right.
Which means they'd already had SARS.
Which
And Zhong Nanshan, which I said, Zhong Nanshan, I thought they did a paper 2013, and I thought it might have been an anomaly. But then I recently found an article in The Lancet which shows that in 2006, the American expert said that SARS had disappeared. The WHO said that SARS had disappeared. But Zhong Nanshan said it hasn't disappeared. 2006, published in The Lancet. So I got a confirmation, because I thought it'd just been an anomaly. That one paper that he wrote was a study in 2012 saying that SARS didn't disappear and that they detected it in 20% of children in Guangzhou born after SARS disappeared. So if that's the case, that's why they said it doesn't matter. But it was an internal battle going on in China. It was a political battle between different forces, reflecting this increasing. Now, it was a bad way it reflected itself, but it reflecting this increasing, if you like, militancy and power of the lower level workers, and then the bureaucrats trying to respond to that in a way that doesn't get them in trouble.
Right.
So that's the actual dynamic of what happened, and that's why when the lockdowns ended, that's why the government wanted the lockdowns to end, but they couldn't end it because all these bureaucrats have got authority and power. So it's a different vision from, it's not praising Xi Jinping or praising the lockdowns or praising anything. It's just describing what happened. What actually happened was not the same as what happened here. What happened here is once they got the lockdowns in motion, then all the private companies ran up, I've got a solution, pay me, I'll be the drugs, I'll be the thing. And Bill Gates jumped into the loop with all his preparatory work and immediately gained control of the response everywhere in the Western world. And then all the ramping up, all the technology, the fucking surveillance, all the policing, all the secret services, all the media control, that was all related to an internal thing here. It wasn't copying China. It was an internal dynamic in the Western world.
You think?
Yes. It's not the same thing. I mean, they've got private companies in charge of the whole operation here.
So,
And our response was worse.
but the CCP, they will censor WeChat and things like that, wouldn't they? If there's dissidents' voices on there.
Yeah, but I mean, I used to write for the Chinese State Council website, and the people who are doing the editorial, the people who are looking at the articles you send in, they're not like, they don't know really what they're looking for. They're just looking for, is this going to cause me trouble?
Right.
That's all they look for.
Right.
I started getting stopped. The first article I got stopped for was an article about Trump. When Trump got elected, I wrote an article making fun out of him, and then that was refused. And then I thought, why did they refuse that? It's just like, it's good for them. And then I thought to myself, of course, they're thinking, if we publish this about Donald Trump, it means people in China can publish similar lampooning of Xi Jinping.
Right.
That's what it is.
Right.
Right. So another time, I wrote an article when the Catalan movement was developing, the Catalan protest movement was developing. I wrote an article opposing Catalan independence, and I got an email back saying we've just been written to by the Spanish embassy asking us not to publish anything on Catalonia. And
What the Chinese had?
The Spanish embassy wrote to the Chinese and said to them, please don't publish another Catalonia. And they said, okay, we won't. So they come under all sorts of pressures, So, and the pressures aren't what they appear. And that's the disadvantage. You can see a totalitarian regime, or a dictatorial regime has weaknesses that a democratic regime doesn't have. Because if the dictatorial regime is confronted by people on the streets, you can't say, okay, Xi Jinping, if you all want to shout down with Xi Jinping, it doesn't matter because we're now going to have an election and you can elect, Joe Bloggs, because you don't have an electoral system to do that. Right. And therefore, the authority of the entire regime is at stake straight away. And so the system is actually, from that point of view, is more susceptible to pressure from the streets than a Western system where you immediately say, okay, if it really comes to, we're really against the wall, call an election. And you can have Keir Starmer instead. And then they get honeymoon of 6 months at least before the next protests start. And then they say, we'll do what you want. Whereas in China, Xi Jinping has to suddenly turn around and say, oh, I've listened to you and you were right all along. Or this guy was responsible. I didn't realise he was a lower level bureaucrat and he did it and I didn't realise.
So your understanding in all this, is that part of the reason why you don't believe, possibly unconceivable, that Freemasons are doing anything untoward? Well, not anything untoward, but for instance, running the show. Because you see the nuance in the power struggle and how it is all set out. You don't. Is that why? I
mean, Masons themselves. I mean, there's no Masons as far as I know in China, but they have triads and things like that. But and party committees, which will be linked into interest groups and mafia gangs in China.
Right.
So there's real struggles around those things in China. But in the Western world, there are certainly in Britain there's Masonic influence and so on. But again, inside the Masons, there'll be different groups.
Yeah.
Not just one group, and they'll be reflecting different interests as well.
But they're definitely a real thing.
Yeah, but I mean, if you look at these people, and sometimes we went to meetings and we confronted some of these people who were in power, in Britain, Matt Hancock and Chris Whitty and people.
Yeah.
They're not what you'd imagine to be these great, demonic, clever beings. Like Matt Hancock's a jumped up middle class twat.
Yeah, he is.
He's not particularly smart.
No.
But he's been played by people who've got power, and he gets something out of it as well. But he's not a particularly smart agent, a great player who knows, like, he's got some plan, he's going to do the whole thing. He's just a little...
Probably someone's son or someone's nephew or something.
Creepy little middle-class kid who... Well, in the sort of school I went to, he would have got a slap.
Yeah, right, me too.
And so, yes, I mean, that there's a flip side to that, which is someone like that, tries to assert, I'm now somebody who listen to me, you know what I mean? And we saw that throughout the whole pandemic thing. But at the same time, look at him, he's a weaseling toad now, isn't he? He's a nobody.
Right.
And it must be like that. And it's the advantage of the system here that you have that you don't have these great geniuses plotting things. Again, the same with Klaus Schwab. Remove Klaus Schwab and the same thing will continue.
Yeah, right.
So it's not Klaus Schwab.
No.
Klaus Schwab's a figurehead, and it is
it's
but
communism.
reasonable and correct. Oh, there you go. With Prince Charles as the front man, King Charles as the front man. That's the problem. You see,
It's an ideology, though.
it's an interest group because
Have an ideology.
they have a method of working which draws on different ideologies
have
and
an
puts them
ethos.
together in a little bag.
They have their own.
It puts them in a bag and it says, this is our little package of sweets that we're going to give you.
Yes,
Right?
and they've nicked a lot of that from communism.
And they've nicked a lot of that from China and from elsewhere because it serves their interest to try and... One, there is a competition between China and the West, that's true. And that competition between Chinese system and the West is an ongoing conflict. The Chinese have got their own internal conflicts and the West has got its own internal conflicts. But they do try to draw on these things, of course.
Well, I got to ask, just because you've got a doctorate in China, was this not bipolar, this multipolar shift that's going on? Is this America used to be the top dog in the world and it's going to China? Is that right? Is this happening in the next 10, 20 years?
The Chinese government would like to imagine that, but again, it's my view that the internal conflicts in China are the central question, not, and that's what shapes policy in China. That's what I've tried to illustrate with this example about the COVID stuff. It wasn't decided by
the
some
little bods.
It's decided by a conflict between the little bods and the upper bods, and then the different bureaucratic layers in between, and also between capital and bureaucracy in China. So that's one, like to play a nuance that actually grasps the internal contradictions that are driving Chinese society. Yeah, so part of those contradictions are that the Chinese state would like to maintain its power, and it wants to maintain that power by globally outsmarting the Americans and challenging American power. And there are many countries in the world that would like to align in some way or another. But it's a moving, it's a moving question. It's not easy to make an alliance with Brazil that will last long term. You might make some deals. I mean, they were making deals the last 20 years. They had this project called the Belt and Road Initiative. And the idea was that you'd bypass American power by creating railroad, road and sea links that would link together about 60 to 80% of world trade and thereby bypass the American dominance of the sea. Yeah. Because the American ships, navy, controls the sea. But the Chinese don't really have a navy to speak of. They've got a couple of aircraft carriers, something like that. The Americans have got complete dominance of the sea, even to this day. And so these sands will shift, and they won't go the way the Chinese wanted to go. So the Belt and Road Initiative, the war in Ukraine, well, part of it is the destruction of the Belt and Road Initiative, because it was the plan to create road and rail networks that would interlink the European Union, the most powerful economic entity in the world as a totality, with China. And that required connections over Russia and Ukraine. And now that's all been basically scuppered.
So also I thought there was a bit of the Belt and Road Initiative that involved in outsourcing the actual industry work to Africa, like from China. I thought there was there looks to be that sort of process happening.
Well, no, I mean, what it is that if you go up, so an economy when it's developing will go through low capital intensity. So, for example, most poor countries, when they want to industrialize, they have a textile industry, because all you need is a sewing machine and someone working on it, right? And you can start making clothes or fixing clothes or whatever. Yeah. So textile industry has always been a traditional entry point for development of capitalism, and you've got low intensity of capital and high intensity of labour. Right. So you want to shift from that to high intensity capital, low intensity labour. So less workers working on more powerful machines, high technology. Yeah? So an advanced country like America, Silicon Valley is like high tech, billions put into technology, and the number of workers, sit home geeks, blah, 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 that type of thing. So that's the idea of development. A developed country is a country with a high capital intensity and low labour intensity relative to capital. So capital intensity is higher, yeah? So as China's moved up the value chain, is producing more high capital intensity, is based on more high capital intensity, private capitalist companies in China have been moving out of China to countries like Vietnam, Africa, and so on. But this has also been accompanied by some state investment. The state investment might be for infrastructure and roads and rail, and to exchange resources. So they might get coal, cobble, whatever else extracted from in exchange for developing infrastructure in Africa. And that's why Africa is, it's a geopolitical game, because then they get the Africans to look more favourably on China and to want to make trade with them. The problem is that the Americans might come along with a few bucks and pay a few people, and 10 people ruling a country, like a small country in Africa, will jump ship with a couple of bucks. So it's not a very reliable mechanism for gaining influence in those countries.
What about the dollar then?
It can look like it, but you can lose that position straight away.
You think the dollar's going to stay as strong as it is? Are we not living through a time of de-dollarization?
Possibly, but it's not as simple as a lot of people imagine.
No.
The American position is still quite strong.
Yeah.
And as I said, they can buy people quite easily, and they're hoping for an internal crisis in China.
Do you see Taiwan kicking off?
To be honest with you, no. But I could be wrong, but I don't see the Chinese intervening. But the Americans could push the game.
The Americans agree with one China
Well,
policy.
they could push the game. The Americans have got bases, South Korea, Japan.
But if you agree with the one China policy, if you agree with the one China policy, is my point though. If you're not gonna, how are you gonna do that if you agree with Taiwan?
Use one word one way and do something else another way.
Well, yeah.
I mean, Hong Kong was financed by. There's dozens and dozens or hundreds of NGOs in Hong Kong that are financed by the Americans that were promoting so-called independence.
Right.
And
hence why it's such a hub for rebellion then.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Always the CIA.
Well, it's not to be the CIA. You got all sorts of NGOs that push these things.
Yeah,
so,
CIA,
in the name
mate.
of democracy, in the name of freedom, in the name of then they get young people riled up. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of industry has moved from investment has moved from Hong Kong to China. So the big capitalists have moved their resources to China, or a lot of them have, and so the Hong Kong people live in pretty shit conditions. So they didn't live very good under the British either. I mean, I was there in the early 90s, and you go to some apartment blocks and it's like 3 families living in a room, and that was under British rule. So, but it didn't get that much better under a return to China.
But it did
that's
get
what they should have
better.
done.
It, like a little bit.
Yeah, but they should have invested massively in housing. That's the problem with the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government, is that they didn't. They thought, I'd just let Hong Kong be freewheeling, and they should have spent money on housing the people. Yeah,
seems sensible to house your people.
Yeah, well, it depends on your point of view. I'm the same here. It's got the same problem here, isn't it? People don't get a house in London. It's terrible for housing. You want to rent somewhere, it's like £900, for a room. So.
Whole time the government are just importing more people and not building any houses.
Well, I mean, there's plenty of buildings in London empty. There was a mate of mine who squatted a building recently in central London. It was a old Jardine Matheson building, funny connection to Hong Kong, and sitting empty right by Tower Hill. It's got enough room there for 600-700 people, no problem.
Is that right? So this is what is this communism? Is this Marxism? We seize the means of production, but we're also going to seize your property and we're going to appropriate it and do what we see fit with it. Is that what communism means?
It doesn't mean seizing the property of the individual people. It means taking the dominant sectors of the economy into public ownership, 200 companies out of 6 million companies, and then providing resources for the whole rest of the population. So it improve the lives of the majority of the population, increase the property of the majority of the population, and decrease the property of a couple of hundred companies.
So it's literally about drawing it out of the rich.
Well, it's expropriating the dominant sectors of the economy that drive the economy.
Appropriating them.
Yeah, I mean, the story, BlackRock, Vanguard, all that, they
Things
control
like
the direction.
Just get them.
If they're in public ownership.
Right.
I mean, nowadays, if you had I don't know, worldwide, there's about 140 companies that study from 2008, I remember, 140 companies control 40% of world trade. So if they're in public ownership and democratically controlled, then it could be used for the benefit of the people. How they're democratically controlled is another question. That's an important question. How, on a local level, you control how investments take place. That's an important question. And that it doesn't become tyrannical power.
Interesting ideas.
Close. Do you want to close? What time we got?
Yeah, you're at 4 o'clock, so I think you got to go.
4?
Yeah.
Oh, I do have to go.
You're late.
Okay, we're done.
Thank you very much for.
Great.
I thoroughly
Thank
appreciate
you very
that.
much. There's a few other bits, but we've worn ourselves down.
We'll do it again another time, eh?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks to the audience. I'll
Yeah.
I'll try and remind myself the things to post. Yeah.
I'll give you a text anyway.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much.
Sweet.
Thanks to the guys as well.
Thanks, guys. What? Oh, see you later, everybody.
10 minutes.
Fuck.
10 minutes too long you went on there. 'cause
I'm
it
about to piss myself again.
wore you